Okay, so let's dive into Zimbabwe, a nation that's seen, well, quite a bit of change recently.
Definitely. Especially thinking about the shift away from Robert Mugabe back in 2017.
Right, when Emmerson Mnangagwa stepped in. And the big question we want to explore today really is this. Has his leadership actually brought genuine reform?
Or is it more, a continuation of the old ways, just maybe with a different face?
Exactly, because you look at the economy, and it's still facing huge challenges.
Huge is putting it mildly. I mean, hyperinflation. The IMF was estimating it at something like 2,000% annually. That's just mind-boggling.
And the unemployment figures,
Oh,
around 90%, right?
yeah, staggering. And that's not just numbers on a page. That's real people's lives, their daily struggle.
Absolutely. So yeah, in this deep dive, we're going to try and unpack some of that. The complexities, the contradictions maybe in Zimbabwe right now.
Sounds good, because Mnangagwa's arrival, it was framed as this new beginning.
The Second Republic, they called it.
Exactly, a clean break. And he made all these pledges initially.
Lots of talk about fixing the economy, which it desperately needed.
And re-engaging with the West, opening things up, democratic reforms.
But then you fast forward to, say, 2025, and, well, the picture's complicated.
It really is. That hyperinflation is still a massive problem. Unemployment hasn't really budged. It makes you question those initial promises.
Or at least how effective the follow-through has been.
Right. And then you had the 2018 election. Mnangagwa won, technically.
Technically, yes,
Okay.
against Nelson Chamisa. But it was tight, and there were serious allegations right away.
Vote rigging claims, yeah. And then the violence that followed.
So tragic. 6 protesters were killed in those post-election clashes.
Which, doesn't exactly scream democratic reform, does it?
Not at all. It casts a shadow.
And we saw criticisms again in the 2023 re-election. The EU observers pointed out quite a few irregularities.
So it's a pattern, perhaps. It does make you think about the space for critical voices.
Yeah, Wosoinka's point about the absence of criticism being the biggest threat to freedom, it feels relevant here.
It really does.
Yeah.
If people can't question or dissent openly, how free is the society, really?
And to understand Mnangagwa fully, you really have to look back, don't you, at the whole ZANU-PF legacy.
37 years under Mugabe. That's a long time.
A very long time. And that era, it had defining characteristics. The land reforms, for instance.
Which had a huge and awful negative impact on agriculture.
Definitely. And the economic isolation that came with it, plus, let's be frank, a history of repression.
The 5th Brigade comes to mind.
Exactly. Heavy-handed tactics were part of the playbook.
And Mnangagwa wasn't an outsider to that system. He was part of it for decades.
Deeply embedded. Connected to Mugabe, part of the ZANU-PF structure, the patronage, the coercion. He inherited that system, but he also helped build it.
Yeah, he wasn't just handed the keys. He knew how the engine worked.
And we have to mention the Gukurahundi massacres, 1983 to 87.
A truly dark period.
Horrific. Around 20,000 Ndebele civilians killed. And Mnangagwa was the security minister at the time.
That history, it hangs heavy, doesn't it? It shapes how people view him now, understandably.
Absolutely. It raises fundamental questions about whether a real break from that past is possible under his leadership.
And it's not just ancient history either. We've seen more recent things. The response to the COVID lockdown protests in 2020.
Tear gas, arrests. It felt like a familiar pattern to many observers.
Which brings up that Thomas Sankara quote you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
About fundamental change requiring a certain madness.
Yeah. Are these repressive actions calculated strategy? Or is it perhaps a sign of desperation, a kind of institutional madness when faced with challenges? It's hard to say for sure.
And running alongside all this political maneuvering is the economic crisis. It's severe.
Brutal, really. Hyperinflation just destroying savings, the Zimbabwean dollar constantly losing value.
And the black market becoming almost normal. Essential, even.
Pretty much. It's how many people have to survive, and the social impact is enormous.
Especially for young people. That unemployment figure, 80% youth unemployment, according to the World Bank in 2024.
Imagine that. 4 out of 5 young people without a formal job. It's no wonder you see support growing for opposition parties like the CCC.
Led by Nelson Chamisa, yeah. People are desperate for alternatives.
And we saw how that frustration can boil over. Remember the fuel price hike protests in 2019?
Vividly, the government response was incredibly harsh.
Reports of 17 deaths, hundreds injured. And they shut down the internet, too.
A clear tactic to stop people organizing, sharing information.
It really is. It's difficult not to draw comparisons sometimes, maybe cautiously, with places like Venezuela under Maduro.
In terms of that combination, economic collapse, and let's authoritarian responses.
Exactly. Severe hardship, and the state using repression to try and keep a lid on dissent. It raises that big question.
Can repression actually work long term, especially when the economy is failing so badly for so many?
It feels unsustainable, doesn't it? You can maybe suppress things for a while, but unless you fix the underlying economic problems...
Something has to give eventually, which puts Mnangagwa's government in a really tricky spot.
Incredibly precarious. They're walking this tightrope, aren't they? Trying to maintain control, but also needing some kind of economic stability to survive.
So what are the options? Are there signs of potential reform? We hear talks sometimes.
Well, there's discussion about improving land tenure security, trying to make agriculture more stable and productive again.
That seems crucial. And attracting foreign investment.
Yes, that's definitely on the agenda. There were reports, I think, by 2025 of maybe $4 billion in potential Chinese deals.
Okay, so that's one potential path, trying to stabilize things economically.
But even that has risks, right? If you actually empower people economically, maybe through genuine reforms, they might start demanding more political freedom, too.
That's the classic dilemma for regimes like this.
And the flip side is, if the reforms don't work, or if they double down on repression instead.
Then you risk even more instability, more widespread unrest.
Precisely. It feels like you could sketch out two very different scenarios for Zimbabwe, maybe looking ahead to 2030.
Okay, like what?
Well, one scenario is that maybe some of these reforms, perhaps boosted by foreign investment, start to work. The economy stabilizes a bit.
And maybe that wins Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF some breathing room, maybe even some grudging support,
Correct.
especially from younger people just wanting jobs.
Possibly that's one path, but the other path
Is continued economic struggle, maybe more repression?
leading to much wider protests, much deeper discontent. And in that scenario, ZANU-PF's long hold on power could be seriously threatened, maybe even break.
It makes you think about other factors too, like education, Nelson Mandela's famous quote.
Education is the most powerful weapon. Yeah. And in theory, it absolutely can be. An educated, critical citizenry is vital for change.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Well, yeah. Does everyone have access to quality education? Is it free from political influence? If education is restricted or used for indoctrination, its power as a weapon for positive change is, severely blunted.
So access and quality are key. Looking even further out, say 2035, what's the long view?
Longer term. It's possible we see some kind of partial, maybe reluctant reforms. If Mnangagwa or his successors realize pure repression isn't working.
So adaptation for survival.
Perhaps. But if the core economic problems aren't fixed, and if the opposition, maybe the CCC or a unified front, can really get its act together,
Then ZANU-PF's dominance could still significantly weaken over the next decade or so.
I think that's a very real possibility. Their grip isn't necessarily permanent, especially if the pressure keeps building.
So we end up back where we started, really, this central paradox.
Yeah. Zimbabwe caught between that promise, however faded, of reform.
And the reality, or at least the constant potential of repression.
And where it goes from here. It really depends, doesn't it, on the choices the leadership makes.
But also on the Zimbabwean people.
Yeah.
Their resilience, their demands for change.
Absolutely. Their collective voice is crucial.
It leaves you with that final lingering question, I suppose. Is Mnangagwa the person who can actually deliver the kind of fundamental change Zimbabwe needs?
Or is something deeper required? A more fundamental shift in the whole political system?
Yeah, it's definitely a situation to keep watching closely. A complex story, still very much in progress.